Welcome to Flyline Podcast, where we enjoy the interesting stories behind the legendary guides and fishing luminaries connected to Maine fishing. I'm Michael Jones. Today, we'll be talking with our special guest, Bob Mallard. Bob is the former owner of Kennebec River Outfitters and is a registered Maine guide. He is a founding member and executive director of the Native Fish Coalition. Bob is a blogger, a writer, an author, and unique fly designer, and a native fish advocate. He's written for numerous sporting columns in both local and regional magazines and newspapers. He is also a prolific author and has published 5 highly regarded books on fly fishing. Bob is a passionate writer that has a reputation for conducting intensive research based on published scientific data rather than speculation. He is a fly designer for Catch Fly Fishing and is on the pro staff for Epic Fly Rods and Scientific Anglers. He drives the quintessential guide vehicle, the Toyota FJ Cruiser, and can often be spotted bouncing down the dirt roads of Maine in search of native fish in remote parts of the state. Bob enjoys fishing and guiding for native fish on remote streams and ponds in Maine and lives with his talented wife Diana in their home in Skowhegan, Maine. I am proud to have the opportunity to invite today's Flyline Podcast guest, Bob Mallard. Welcome to the podcast, Bob.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Yeah, Bob, it's a long, cold winter, and I can't think of a better project than to sit down with someone that's as knowledgeable as you are about the state of Maine and the fly fishing history of it. Let's get started way back. Tell us how you first got into fly fishing. I know it's deep in your veins, but tell us where the genesis came from.
My grampy, he was what they call, the classic multi-sport. Did everything. Fly fished, ice fished, spin fished, hunted upland game, ducks, deer, and he had 5 boys, of which the youngest was only a year older than me, so I just kind of blended in, and so it was really my grampy that got me into the whole outdoor thing, more so than any of his own children. And we had a fly rod in the house, a couple of them, old glass rods, and we slapped them around the driveway, figured it out. But I was a spin and bait guy before I was a fly guy. And it just, in my teens, it just kind of became something I worked on. And then I got, more and more proficient. And by my late teens, I was, I won't say exclusively, but I was predominantly fly fishing. And from there, I'm on the water 100 days a year, have been for decades, and I'm pretty singularly focused. I don't do much else recreationally but fly fish.
Right, that's an awesome answer, Bob. I love hearing that about you, and I didn't know that. When was your first trip to Maine? How did you get inspired to start fishing in Maine?
So in my early 20s, while working in software, I was shopping at Coleman's Sporting Goods in Woburn, Massachusetts. And there was a gentleman, 10 years older than me, looked 20 years older, who worked in the fly section, or the fishing section, but predominantly their fly section, which was pretty big for a sporting goods store. And as it turned out, he was a transplanted Mainer from Lewiston, Auburn area, who was down there for a woman, a young lady he met skiing, and he was, I think, working at Sugarloaf, and so he was down there, and we became friends and fished local waters, and then neither one of us had a 4-wheel drive. I had at the time, my last car. He had a 2-wheel drive, old International pickup, and I went out and bought a Jeep Cherokee, 1976 Jeep Cherokee with oversized tires and huge engine, and kind of converted it to my first, and since then only, been my 4-wheel drives since I was in my early 20s. But so once I had that, he said, we should go to Maine, and he wanted to go to the place where his dad took him as a kid, and he hadn't been in there in 5 years of whatever. And so we went to the 10,000 acre tract, halfway between the Forks and Jackman, and we went into Round Pond, which was pretty well known at the time, and it was a really hard ride to get into, and a lot of water, alders, rocks, and so we landed on the shore of a round pond and set up a couple of pup tents in what little dry area there was, and pulled out a couple of 9-foot 7-weight rods, which were the trout rod of the day, slapped the canoe off the roof, and folded a little table up and proceeded to fish something I had never seen, never thought existed. And at the time, it was the finest brook trout pond that I've ever seen, wild native brook trout pond.
Yeah, and it's funny how everything is circular, Bob, how that was your first experience in Maine, and then of course you've done so much with all your travel and out west and around the world, fly fishing and river fishing, focusing predominantly on moving water, and now your heart goes pitter-pat when you go to those remote ponds.
It was back then there was people even in Massachusetts were somewhat still water focused. Places stocked trout waters, Walden Pond of Thoreau fame, and so we were chucking bait on those ponds and doing some stocked rivers and stuff, but that was just something wild and new, and I was fascinated by the insect life, the big fish. Back then there were deer and moose and everything stumbling around the woods, and so that coincided with meeting a young man in the Medford, Mass, whose family owned a camp in the White Mountains up in Carroll, and so I was exposed to the small brook trout streams, wild brook trout streams. His family, his dad, his brothers fished mostly the stock rivers, but it didn't take me long to get off the beaten path. So kind of at the same time, I was discovering, Maine ponds and streams, and discovering the White Mountains, and very different. And that was just kind of a launching pad. And as you say, after taking somewhat of a sabbatical and buying one of the first drift boats in New England, and probably the first raft with a rowing frame, and traveling 2 or 3 times a year out to the Rocky Mountains and go to Labrador and on and on and on, I kind of circled back to Maine, and even then my focus was as much on the Kennebec as anything else, and now I'm absolutely back where I started. I fish almost exclusively ponds and small streams.
Yeah, that's just wonderful, Bob. When you were at that time in your life, what was your career? You said software.
I was a hard luck kid who got a GED diploma in Maine, walked in because a girlfriend's mother wouldn't let me in the house until I had a high school diploma. And that led to some testing, and for whatever reason, somebody decided that I could do something that was not on my radar screen, and I went in and took a series of aptitude tests and got immediately thrown into a computer software programming course when, of course, nobody was in software. And that was paid for by the federal government under a Reagan-era program called CETA, C-E-T-A. And then I did a co-op with Honeywell and Bill Ricca, who hired me on the spot, and then I got pirated out of there, and 20 or 15 years later or less, I was a director of software development. I was the CIO for Boston Cellular One in the early stages of cellular. I worked for a consulting firm out of Chicago, and then I went off on my own, and then I walked off the job at 42 years old, leaving a lot of money on the table and a lifestyle that, while it would be a dream for some, wasn't my dream. And so that's how I ended up in Maine and making fishing, fly fishing, my career.
Yes, before you moved to Maine, Bob, where did you call home?
I was born and raised in Newton, Mass. I lived in Medford briefly. I My first, escape from the suburbs was a New Hampshire border town called Pepperell, Mass, with a couple of very well-known fisheries and a bunch of small streams. The Nissitissit River, Squanicook River, they're very popular. And then from there, I bought my first house in Brookline, New Hampshire. So I kept moving north, and that was on Lake Patanapo, which is the headwaters of the Nissitissit. And I had a small trout stream in my backyard. And then I moved to Skowhegan because I was flying weekly at the time. I didn't have a home base, and it really didn't matter where I lived. And I was also maintaining a trailer lease up on Ripigenus Lake that was a lot of time. And so I was as likely to be off on Rip Lake, driving to Bangor at 4 a.m. to catch a plane, as I was to be home. And I picked Skowhegan because it was the last stop before the places that I fished most, Kennebec and the Forks area. And I figured that I would open a fly shop at some point. I didn't anticipate running it. I was just going to open it and hire people to do it for me. And so that was my northern migration. But even where I lived as a kid, Newton, Mass was not the Newton, Mass of today. I mean, we had a lot of ways. We had a lot of fishing, and I grew up in an outdoor family.
Yeah, and when we first met, Bob, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think the first time I ever met you was at Aardvark Outfitters, and you had New Hampshire plates on your vehicle, and you had the first clackacraft that I had seen. We had hides at that point, but you had the first clackacraft, and you were actually quite influential in getting us to take a look at that brand, which Bob and I ultimately switched over to clackacraft because we felt at the time and for many years following that it was a superior design. I think you were probably the first guy with a clackacraft in New England.
I believe I was. At the time when I got my boat, which was long before I moved to Maine and showed up at Aardvark, Danny Legier had an old Michigan Drifter, gray boat, had kicked around a bit. There was a Lavro that had bounced around a bit in over toward Dartmouth College, had been used in somebody in New Hampshire had it, then it went to Vermont. And then a gentleman out of like the Pittsburgh area, a retired game warden, I forget, he had a wooden boat, I believe. And Carol Ware had an old metal tub. I think it was might have been an old hide. And there was probably one more wooden boat kicking around Greenville. And that was it, short of the Delaware. But I had traveled a lot out west, and of course they used drift boats like we use canoes. I had been in, fished out of, and paddled everything in the industry, and just felt that clacks were a superior boat for several reasons.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think there's one name that you missed on your list, and that would have been John McLeod.
Yeah, he was the wooden boat I think I was talking about out of Greenville. He was because I said there were one other boat kicking around. I do believe it was McLeod.
Yeah, so he did. He had his one of his boats was wooden, and then he actually got the same thing that Danny ended up buying, which is what you just said was Michigan what?
Michigan Drifter, if I remember.
Yep, John had one of those, and he brought Danny down the East Outlet, and Danny went home that afternoon and got on the phone and ordered one. And Danny's very quick to tell that story because he was just so enamored with what the capabilities of a drift boat were for a guide. And obviously you and I know all about that. But speaking of going out west, Bob, one of the things that a very strong impression I had, and I think many people did who were in Maine at the time when you first started kind of really showing up on the rivers, is you had skill sets from basically using Western techniques like nymphing and fishing with strike indicators and fishing a lot of different fly patterns that were not common to Maine fishing. And you were, it was quite obvious to everyone that you were catching more fish when other people weren't with traditional approaches. Do you remember what that was like? I mean, going to the Roach River and just cleaning up with your, using some different stuff?
Yeah, I at the time was, at one time I was dating a woman out of Greenville. And I went up to the Roach, which I had been fishing a lot at the time, mostly out of my trailer up in Chesuncook. And back then, the standard was swinging streamers. That's what most Mainers were doing up there. There was a couple of New Hampshire folks who fished it really hard at the time, and they did things like straight lining big stoneflies and buggers on a sink tip. And I remember stepping into the warden's pool with a pretty good crowd and nobody really doing anything, and I crossed the lower end of the pool and got across from everybody and started, and I put up, like 6 fish in 15 minutes. And people there was some people that actually got mad and left.
Right.
And then some others, catcalled across as if somehow I was like mishandling fish or doing something wrong or snagging them, whatever. And there was one gentleman, when I came across, asked me who I was and where I lived, and that led to a phone call a few days later where he was the outgoing director of Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, I believe, or prior director. And next thing I know, I'm on a conference call with George Smith and him, asking, how the hell I'm doing what I'm doing. And now I'm doing dumb fishing. I'm fishing for little brook trout that, will eat anything if I can put it where they are. So it's more about accuracy and a willingness to get off the beaten trail.
Yeah, and probably a desire to have an escape, because you're not standing at the warden's pool with 8 guys and someone tapping their foot trying to get into your spot. Instead, you're going to some place where you and your partner might be completely alone.
Yeah, I mean, I skipped the roach this fall for probably the first time in my life. I've got a couple of friends. It's an emotional thing. They go every year, and I bailed. And I said, it's just not my thing anymore.
Yeah.
And I, as you say, where I fish on the streams, I typically park, walk heads down, half hour to an hour and 20 minutes, and bushwhack down to a stream, fish till I'm tired, GPS back up to the trail. Wonderfully, the White Mountains, most of the trails are within easy shot of a stream, and 3.5, 4 hours on the water, I never see anybody. I mean, literally never. And ponds are less fish today than they were when I was a kid. And I don't like elbow to elbow fishing.
No, I don't either. I can't stand it, a matter of fact. So what was your vision for Kennebec River Outfitters, Bob? You had a lot of talent, ability, vision, experience in other fly shops, and you saw that there was a niche in Maine that was missing. Tell us how that all went for you in terms of your vision.
Well, I had been floating the Delaware and some other big rivers and stuff in Pennsylvania, even Massachusetts to a degree, put the first drift boat on the Deerfield River that anybody had ever seen. And I just, I had learned to fish big fish out of the boat, and which was big streamers tucked tight to the banks. And I saw the Kennebec, the middle Kennebec, as being the premier, highest potential fishery at the time in the New England. But, we didn't have that Western shop. And so that was my goal, was to build, a Western-like shop. I said, I want a shop that would fit in West Yellowstone, Montana.
And you ran a guide service out of the shop?
Yes. I knew right away that there was a lot of pressure on me to get my guide license and from my clients. But I knew that the trap was that if I got my guide license, I would quickly become my own best guide. And I don't mean best as in skill, I mean best as in demand. So, because most of my clients came from out of state. And so what I did is the best way to tell your client you can't take them out is to not have a guide license. So I deliberately stayed out of it, and I brought people in to do it. And I subbed stuff over to other shops where applicable, and it worked. And then, when I got rid of the shop, I said, now I can get a guide license because there's no conflict. But what happens in the shop is if I take that trip, my retail sales slide badly, and I've got to pay somebody to be in there. And so I look at the end of the day and I say, my retail sales suffered greatly. I paid somebody to be in the shop, and I'm out on the water, and, so it made financial sense to run my own shop.
That's great, Bob. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think we're at a pretty good spot here to take just a few minute break, and if you don't mind, we're going to come back, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about your writing.
Okay.
On this Flyline flashback, we are going to throw back to the 1940s to discuss an up-and-coming Maine author. Louise Dickinson Rich was a writer known for fiction and non-fiction works about New England rural living. While on a canoe trip with a girlfriend in Maine, she met Ralph Eugene Rich, a businessman who had recently returned to the land to serve as the new dam keeper for Lower Dam on the Rapid River. They married a year later and split seasons between the summer house, a lofty uninsulated structure looming over the river, and the winter house, a small dark cabin more suited for burning wood and comfort through the hard Maine winters. Louise's first book, We Took to the Woods, was published in 1942 and became a national bestseller. It tells about her life with her husband and children in the wilds of western Maine. Stories, often filled with dry humor, of living off the land, bartering and trading for needed items, surviving rugged winters, encountering woodsmen on log drives, and the follies of remote living on the edge of the wilderness. The book became a regular on the reading list for Maine school classrooms, and Rich went on to write a total of 27 books. Louise will go down in history as one of the most prolific Maine women writers of the 20th century. And now let's return to the second part of our show. Well, we need to definitely cover a couple of more really important topics that kind of create the shadow of who you are. Or I should say the light that shines from you, Bob. The light that shines from you. No, seriously, let's talk about your writing. Tell me about your first book. When did you decide that you were going to write, and what was that process like?
When I came to Maine, I had never, in my wildest dreams, did I think I would be published for anything. And so my first paid writing assignment, my first public writing, it was op-eds, believe it or not. It was letters to the editor. It was asking, what's going on the Kennebec? How are we crashing a river that, a fishery that was supporting 5, fly shops at the time. So it started with op-eds, and the bar is really low because they don't expect good writing. They just expect an opinion. Then it was, my first paid assignment was Paul Reynolds at the Northwood Sporting Journal. He asked me to do some tackle writing. So I did. The next thing I know, I was doing some stuff for Harry and over at the Maine Sportsman. New England fly fishermen, Fly Fishing New England, I think it was called at the time. They contacted me for Maine Piece and then, Eastern fly fishing. So all of a sudden, I was getting this weird flurry of writing requests, Fly Fish America and Fly Fishermen. And so, it was never a plan. It just was this organic thing where, op-eds morphed into, or letters morphed to the editor morphed into op-eds morphed into columns and art guest columns. And then, next thing I know, I was writing a lot. And so my first foray into books, again, was an accident. I figured, okay, I'm apparently, qualified to punch out articles on topics I know a lot about. But the idea of a book was like way outside my radar. And Terry and Wendy Gunn of Lee's Ferry Angler in Arizona, they were working on a book called 50 Best Tailwaters to Fly Fish. Stonefly Press was the up-and-coming fly fishing publisher at the time. And they were changing the whole where-to thing. They went to the large high-gloss format, maps, things like that. And they also started this model where the, quote, author of the book was using people from the industry and the angling community to contribute chapters. So they found me, and I'd never met Terry in my life, and asked me if I would write the Rapid River in Maine. Now I'm thinking, there's a lot of people who know more about the Rapid than I do, but and I said, there are people who live there, and again, it was one of these things where I said, Bob, you because you're not burdened by pride of place, we trust that you won't overdo it, and you have some name recognition at this time. So that was my first writing in book, was contributing a chapter to the Guns Tailwater book. He said, this is very good, Bob, and I need somebody to write the Deerfield River in Mass, and I've heard that you were a Mass guy, and I heard that you ran the first drift boat down the Deerfield, so I contributed that chapter. So I ended up with 2 chapters in that book. And it had happened at a time when, my writing my article writing was pretty visible. And then the publisher, Ann Terry, came back to me and said, we're working on these series and we're ready to do the Northeast, and we'd like you to write it. And it was done as a collaboration. Recruit a bunch of people, write as many chapters as I want. So I said, sure. And it's a lot of work, a book, and it's not a lot of money. And it's kind of funny when I first did that one, here I am taking a guide, Chris Thompson, Cash Haley, whoever, and I'm having them write a chapter in a book that's going to have national visibility, that's going to have their name in it, their picture, it's going to have a short bio, links to their website, on and on. And I bumped into some issues in State College, Pennsylvania, only arguments as to who should have written which, not that it shouldn't have been written. And so that was my second book, and I vowed never to do a collaboration again, because it's harder. Editing, 40 people who've never written publicly or professionally in their lives, it's a lot of work. I could have written it myself. Way easier. I could have promoted only Bob Mallard in that book. It was up to me where I wanted to go. They said, this format works. You can go there, or you can write the thing yourself. And I said, no, I think the right thing to do is to involve as many people as I could, even people who weren't good to me. I involved, and I still do today.
I have to admit, I think you're right, that at first glance, when someone introduces this idea that Bob is going to have a culmination of other people writing, it's something kind of inherent to our community in Maine, in the Maine fishing community, that there's jealousy and animosity. As an example, I've been down the East Outlet probably over 1,000 times in a drift boat, and I take issue with the fact that you didn't ask me or Danny Legier to write that chapter on the East Outlet, but now I have the book and I read George Smith's description of it. No one could have written it better.
Yeah, well, there is one of the things is that book, which is also somewhat of a collaboration, that came 7 years after my first collaboration, which was the Northeast book. What I did is I went to the fly shops and I chose Penns Creek Angler, whatever, to write, because that gives some level of credibility to people who don't know these areas or don't know these people. But when I came out, I said, I'll never do it again. It was hard, because you got to hold people to a certain number of words per chapter, or else, I got an 8-page novel about one river and a 20-word snippet on another. Plus, you have to do a lot of editing, because it can't look completely different, and fact-checking. So I came out of it and I said I'd never do that again. And then I wrote 3 solo books in a row. And then when I decided to go forward with the main book, after starting and stopping 5 times over 20 years, I said, I'm going to go with that format again, because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for Maine. It's the right thing to do for people who make a living on our waters. And I did change the rules a bit, because the more you write, the more success you have, the more leverage you have with publishers. And I didn't want the rigid count. I didn't want to say, you got to do this within X number of words. So I let people write.
I think your choices were really accurate. I just want to, for the listener, Androscoggin River, is a place I spent a ton of time. William Clooney, I mean, he is a guide. Yeah, you can hire William, but there's nobody that's probably written more about that part of the state than William Clooney has. Kennebago River, Bob Romano. I mean, you couldn't. He's kind of like the Tom Brady of the Kennebago River, really. And then Brett Dam, who runs the Rangeley Regional Fly Shop, writing a chapter on the McGalloway River. I mean, I think your choices are spot on, Bob. You offered a product for the consumer. I mean, this is about promoting the state of Maine. And I wasn't convinced of what this book was until I bought it. It's a gem. You just really hit the ball out of the park with this, and I think you got the right characters involved.
Part of the whole idea with this book was it wasn't, and I will never write a stand here cast this book. It's never going to come out about Mallard. It's about, I don't like the word they use now, but this experiential stuff. It's about telling people why. Why would you fish here instead of somewhere else? It's about bringing back history, geography, biology. All of that's been removed from our fishing books to a point we've dumbed them down so much I find them hard to read. So that was the other thing. And I was in a place where I could do something for Maine that I don't believe that, at least right now, that anyone else could penetrate the market outside of Maine. There are a number of people who do better inside Maine promoting this book, but outside Maine, we don't need intrastate promotion. That doesn't help. That doesn't put people in guide boats. It doesn't put people in hotels. It doesn't sell out, non-resident licenses. And I'm in a unique position because of my writing, NFC, other stuff, to really reach out way beyond our own borders to people who can help us in a lot of different ways. Non-resident licenses, twice as much money.
So, Bob, I think that we can both agree, and I know that we'll both agree, that what ends up happening if we don't promote places that are viable other than just the real obvious hotspots, is the state gets loved to death. As an example, Mailbox Pool on the McGalloway River. Rangeley Lakes Heritage Trust set up a counter to count the number of times someone walks down the path to Mailbox Pool on the McGalloway River. As of late September, 2,600 people walk to fish in one pool. That's loving it to death, man. That's not good.
No. And I mean, what you'll get if you write at all in the state of Maine more than anywhere else I've written, you get this spot burning. Mainers get mad. You're burning, spot burning. And the McGalloway, the Rapid, they've been written about so many damn times by Mainers.
Too much. Too much.
Yeah, I'm not adding anything, necessarily to that. The one thing is when I talk about the Rapid, I'm talking about bass and how they're bad for the fishery. But if we look at what we now call love to death, and it is happening, it's the Rapid, it's the McGalloway, it's the Roach, and it's Grand Lake Stream, and it's the East Outlet.
And
those are the ones that are getting clobbered. Yeah, and we were doing a much better job of spreading angler traffic around 25 years ago or 40 years ago. I've actually lived in Maine now 25 years. Than we are today. And part of that problem is that when we crashed, and no one can deny that we've crashed, they can get emotional, they can get mad, but they can't deny that we crashed the Kennebec and we crashed the Androscoggin trout fisheries. That displaced hundreds of anglers. The typical Saturday at Shawmut Dam alone, it wasn't unusual to see 25, 30, even 40 anglers.
Yes.
You could drive up to Waterville and there was another 20. You could go to Skowhegan and there was a half a dozen or 4 to 6 people in the eddy. You go to Madison, there was another 20, 30. You go to Solon and there was, 6 drift boats on the water. You go to Bingham, and just on and on. So the damage we did to these fisheries that we now say are being loved to death, it's on us. We did that. We ruined the Kennebec. And when I say ruined, I fish the Kennebec. It's my home water. I still go down there. I don't run my drift boat in Solon often, but I wade Madison. I don't fish Skowhegan at all. I don't go to Shawmut. I pick my times at Bingham. But take that, and then take the Sheepskin, and then take, the Andro, Bingham, the Gilead stretch. And these people didn't quit fishing. They just moved.
Yeah.
And nothing put more pressure on Rangeley than the loss of the Androscoggin fishery. And that's the role that these glamour fisheries can play. They can take pressure off of wild native delicate fisheries. They can be economic drivers. The Kennebec, as you know, if you include Aardvark, there were 5 shops making a living off the Kennebec, and guides and stores and hotels and campgrounds. And
the only reason that I don't guide trout as much as I used to is because it's not there for me anymore.
It's underwhelming, and this is a problem. And when I say that, people bristle. I had a guy get in my face in Madison a couple years ago about my negative comments about the river, and I looked down and I said, What am I seeing? A half mile or more river? It's just you and I standing here. I said, are you shitting me? I said, look at this resource. It's so underused, and it's underused because it's not that good. And the same thing happened to Solon. I really struggle to haul my boat. I put my boat on Solon, twice in the last 3 years. And there was a time when I put my boat on Solon 30, 40 times a year.
Oh, yeah.
And,
yeah, absolutely. And we did go down the section last year, you and I, in Solon. And we had a nice day. I mean, we caught some browns, and the fishing was good. But it certainly, it has been better, right?
And it's been a lot better. It's not just a little bit better.
Let's talk about George Smith, if you don't mind. And then I'd like to also talk about Native Fish Coalition a little bit. And I think our hour will be about up by then. If we could talk about George Smith, I just know that he's a special person to a lot of people in Maine. There's a lot of people that misunderstood George. I think George did a lot to make himself misunderstood. And but he was inspirational to you, Bob, wasn't he?
Yes, it was an interesting relationship, to say the least. George and I, as I said, we met over this nymphing the Roach River thing. And we fished together. He came up, I put him in the drift boat in Solon, we spent a day on the water. And and I had the same opinion of George Smith as most people. I was not a big fan of some of his positions. I didn't necessarily like, what Sam was doing. And I corrected him right out of the gate. He made that, a reference to antes. And I said, not in my boat. That's not how I play. And I said, let's not call people names. Let's start there. But midpoint in the day, he said, I'd like you to join our fishing initiative committee, Sam's fishing initiative committee, which at the time was like an all-star team. It was Harry Vanderweed, Dennis Smith, Greg Pont, Gary Corson, Courtney, on and on and on. And I said, I'll be honest with you, I have no interest in working with Sportsman's Alliance of Maine. It's not my thing. And he said, why? And I said, because I disagree with a lot of things you stand for. And he said, but you agree on wild native fish? And I said, absolutely. He said, so why don't we focus on what we agree on and not worry about what we don't? And so that was the first time I knew George was different. I said, this guy is not what I thought. The other thing is, when I was cleaning my boat out at the end of the day, there was a little Ziploc bag and a cup holder. Every snippet of tippet, every busted fly was in this bag. And so, that led to a very odd relationship. I mean, George Smith certainly had closer friends than he and I, but we talked very regularly. And we worked on several projects together, important projects, state heritage fish law with Sam, regulation simplification, remote ponds. After Sam, I was his primary support for what's now the North Zone live bait restriction. George was not a detail guy, but no one worked the legislature better than George Smith. So what I brought to George was an IT background and an ability to collect and disseminate information and data and research. And so it was a good relationship. And I tell people, I'm not sure, very few people have done more for Maine's outdoor scene than George. And that's why the book is dedicated to him. It's why he wrote the foreword. When I talked to him about the book, he said, "This is a very good idea, Bob. The timing's right. You're the right person to do it." And I said, would you write the foreword? And he, kind of hemmed and hawed. And I said, well, George, who else should write this? No one. And he agreed. And then he wanted to write a chapter. And, it was a sad thing to be pushing that book to the publisher as George is going down for the count. And when it finally, we were deep into manuscript work, and George had passed away, I reached out to his family and said, listen, I don't know if you even know who I am. I said, but here's where I'm at. And I'm not comfortable pushing forward as planned without your blessing and permission. And they said, of course we know who you are, Bob. George spoke very highly of you. And the next thing I know, they said, send us what you have. I sent it. And, the support was phenomenal. Gordon, his brother, Edie, his sister, and Linda, his wife, they all said, go forward. I recently, when the book came out, I drove sent a couple of signed copies to Edie, who shared it around at Christmas, and then said, I need 5 more. The family all wants these things. And I drove to Herman, Maine, and delivered another 5 to Edie.
The Smiths were great people. I mean, I grew up in Mount Vernon with George, and he and my father served on the Selectmen's Committee for my entire life. And Linda was, just still is a wonderful human being. And George's loss is going to leave a deep hole in our community that'll take a long time to ever fill. Not just the Mount Vernon community, but the fishing community. And the thing about George was so interesting to me, Bob, is that if you met him in person, he was an infectious person. He was you just loved him. But when I would read his op-eds or his articles, it felt like his agenda was just very different than what I thought. And we actually got into an argument. We were raising our voices outside in the hallway at a legislative committee one day over fish stocking, and all of a sudden he's kind of just probably did the same thing that he did with you a few times, and that just said, hey, let's agree on what we agree on, Mike. I understand you have English setters. Can we go hunting sometime? And I just thought it was so disarming, And I said, okay, yeah. So he came up to Greenville, and he and I spent a day bird hunting over my dogs. And I was in love with him by the end of the day. He was like a friend again. And that's why my father and he were always friends, is despite their differences, George was a good man.
He was a charming man. My wife loved him. And the last time we floated together, he was already in trouble. And the funny thing is, I'm rowing, soling. I got, George in front of me, Diana behind me, and all they did all day was yacked away to each other, like hardly cast. And I'm sitting there. Could somebody please put a rod in the water? Can we try to get a fish? And all George kept saying was, next time we should leave him home. He's getting awful whiny. And, the two of them just bantered all day. And it was just the kind of thing. My wife kept a thing on our refrigerator for years that said, my man George, with a picture of George on it. And he was a nice man. He was a very likable guy. And, the Hellfire and Brimstone, Sportsman's Alliance of Maine, George, it was a different person. And we saw it when he left Sam. He absolutely stopped defending stuff that he didn't personally do. When he was with Sam, he did what Sam wanted when he was there. But I would tell you, the single most defining moment in George Smith, we were all in Orono at the college, at the big civic center or whatever, and the National Park Service was there talking about Katahdin woods and water. And I'm in the group ready to crowd, I'm one of the people who's going to stand up, and I'm going to defend the idea of a national monument or national park. And I know I'm going to get my ass handed to me. And some people really disappointed me, stood up in favor of this, what I think is a terribly flawed state model, which requires multiple use and logging and stuff. And so, and it was interesting because Baxter is more strict than any national park I've ever been in. So really, what threw us all is when it came George's time to stand, and I'm going to be behind him, and I'm thinking, coming in clean up after George is not going to be easy. And he shuffled, he looked down, and he went for 10 minutes about how he supported that proposal and how he personally liked Roxanne Quimby. And when he was done, I just looked at the people I was with, and I said, I'm not even going to stand up. I don't have to. George just basically pushed this thing over the goal line. And,
hold for applause, right? I mean, that kind of defines what George turned into in his later in life. I mean, he actually saw the light, because there's nothing wrong with Roxanne Quimby. She's doing nothing different than Percival Baxter did, right? Am I, Bob?
It's nothing different. And George and I, we had a big blow up over his Ban Roxanne sticker. He pulled into the parking lot at the shop, and I said, move your truck, put it across the road. I don't want it in my parking lot. And I said, this is, a woman who's trying to give us, 80,000 acres of land. I said, are you kidding me? You're going to vilify this poor woman? And I've met her, and she's a nice lady. And, I say, we were a much better group of human beings in Percival's day than we are today, because she's doing nothing. In fact, Katahdin Woods and Water is less restrictive than Baxter. And she gave, $13 million to run it. She's got chunks of land going over to Acadia. She just grabbed a chunk of land and gave it back to the Penobscots. I mean, come on now. It's
right.
Like, really? If I had that land, or if you had that land, would we be as generous as Roxanne Quimby? No way.
Well, Bob, we've got to talk about Native Fish Coalition. No conversation is complete with Bob Mallard without discussing that, because that's really your big beacon right now. How did the Native Fish Coalition come about? What was the first step?
I had dropped out of the game pretty notably, and without a lot of fanfare. I just was tired of the lack of support. I was tired of reading about myself on the internet or hearing about myself. And I just said, you know what, I'm done. I've done what I can. I've tried to, keep the Kennebec from going down the toilet. I've tried, to keep our brook trout here, but I'm done. I said, I'm not going to be the lone voice in the woods. And I quit everything. And when I quit Sportsman's Alliance of Maine's Fishing Initiative Committee, it wasn't received well. Harry, Gary, and some others were like, who are you to just walk away? And I said, I'm walking away. And I did. I went pretty darn quiet for a couple of years there. And the first chink in the armor was Bill Townsend, a wonderful man, done more for Maine than most people. Mm-hmm. He's a top 3 Mainer as far as conservation. And Bill was a regular customer. He came in and said, do you mind locking the door and putting the close sign up? And I said, I'm thinking, what the hell does he want? And he just said, it's time, Bob, get back in the saddle. He says, I get it. You're beat up, you're burnt out, you burnt yourself out. And he said, but you need to get back in. And I said, but it's not well received. And he said, it's never well received. He said, anybody who bucks the trend, challenges the status quo, gets the crap knocked out of him. And he said, but you're tougher than that. So that was the first. And then I was talking to George. And George said, Bob, you need to get back in. We need more help. And I said, George, I'm tired of the hate mail, And George said, Bob, I get hate mail from old ladies. And he said, again, stop your whining. And I was like, all right. So I supported George's this idea. He and I had it was 2 bills. One was to was to expand the protections for the state heritage fish waters to their tributaries. Like, what a no-brainer. If we're going to disallow live bait on these waters because it's dangerous, how on earth can we justify allowing it on the tributaries? And so the thing is that law was passed. IF&W had 10 years to address the loopholes. They chose not to. And once again, George was heading the legislature because they weren't going to do it. And I wanted to get the criteria for adding waters aligned with the criteria we used for putting the waters on. At some sleight of hand during the legislature, while the rules for the original list were clear, not stocked or not stocked in 25 years, somehow in some backroom dealing, the rules for adding waters said the commissioner may add waters using criteria that they define. So the whole thing, they just stopped adding waters. And so that was the start. And we went in, and my part of it got killed right away. Audubon waffled on it. TU was kind of non-support. I won't say against it, but they certainly didn't support it. Audubon actually rolled over on us. I was stunned that they would have, and I'm sure it was W pressure.
Bob, just for clarification, what specifically were you asking for that they were giving you pushback on?
It was we simply wanted the verbiage in the law specific to adding new waters to the heritage list to mimic that was used to establish the list. That's all I wanted. And there was obviously pressure. The part of it that was to expand the protections, the no stocking and no live fish as bait to the tributaries, there was some things that George didn't understand. Like, tributary has a legal meaning in Maine, and it is inlets only. It's not outlets. So I said, we got some technicalities we're going to need to work around. But with that said, I said, let's throw this thing up and see what happens. George was no longer with Sam. I wasn't affiliated with anybody. Emily Bastian joined us as a third person. And while we didn't get a law passed, they held the bill over, acknowledged that it was a gaping hole, and told IF&W to fix it. Put a working group together and fix it. Come back in a year with a plan to address this problem. And the working group, of which I was not invited to participate, they went off, and long story short, they came back with nothing. Then they got sent back to do it again. But so I was on my way home from the hearing, and my cell phone rang. It was a Washington, D.C. number, nobody I knew, and a young gentleman from Maine, born and raised in Maine. He said, my family's never been anywhere else. He's a hot shot for the Republican National Convention, a consultant. And he said, I just listened to this podcast. And he said, and I'm ashamed of my state that those two amendments didn't pass. And he said, I'm angry that people didn't support him. And he admitted to not being a huge George Smith fan. And he said he knew who I was. And he said, you need to get organized. He said, Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, post-George, is out of the game. They're no longer a voice for wild native fish. That was George. And he said, TU is more into, kids camps and stuff and outreach. And he said, we need a group, kind of like the old Deaners that I was part of. And he offered money, legal papers, incorporation, help with a logo, build a website, if I was willing to get back in the saddle. So it wasn't my idea. And it was born in Maine, by Mainers. And I was reluctant, because I said, listen, I'm not sure I want to get back into the, lion's den. And so I agreed to do it. And I brought in Emily, George, Ted Williams, and I said, we're just going to kind of do the Dud Dean thing. We're going to at least make sure that there's a group of the legislature that represents wild native fish, period. I don't care if it's 10 people or 10,000 people, we're going to do it. So that's how it started. And Ted was actually the first, or this young gentleman who helped us start, he was our first executive director. Ted Williams was the national chair because he had a lot of name recognition and contacts, and I was the the national vice chair, and Emily Bastian was the main chair, and so that was kind of how it rolled out. And then, Tom stepped back because of his Washington, D.C. work and continues to support us. And then, I moved in, and then we kind of all moved up. But what happened, total surprise, was all of a sudden, we had interest in New Hampshire, Vermont, Mass, Connecticut, Pennsylvania. Long story short, we're in 15 states right now, from Maine to Alabama. We've got money in the bank. We have influence. We are bringing up 2 more chapters as we speak. We're probably heading to the Great Lakes next. The native fish message has never been stronger in my life. The media is supporting it. The industry is supporting it. And we are finally seeing a change in focus. And I think part of it, it's really weird. This whole thing is in some ways really difficult in Maine, in other ways really easy in Maine. The easy part in Maine is Mainers love brook trout. They don't care about brown trout and rainbow trout. And they don't want them to go away any more than I want them to go away. We just disagree on what has to happen to prevent them from going away. And that's a matter of education and experience. The other thing I'm seeing is people who thought I was an alarmist 20 years ago have now lost their favorite water. And when you lose your favorite water, you're a changed person because you're like, okay, it happens. It just happened to me. So that's changing. What's tough in Maine is as far as sportsmen go, we're a pretty consumptive lot. And we're more likely to be bait fishermen, notably more likely to be bait fishermen and harvesters than the Western guy. I mean, I've spent countless days out west. I've never seen anybody string or a trout, never. And I don't see bait fishing and spin fishing, and I'm not knocking them. It's not a social issue. It's never been a social issue. It's an impact issue, treble hooks and bait, 30% incidental mortality. That's a tough, thing to accept when we're talking about wild native fish. If it was me, every stock fishery in Maine would be open to whatever the heck you wanted to use. I don't care. So that's how we started, and it's outgrown me. It's outgrown any of us. It has momentum. For the first time in my life, when I get an email, I got to look at a list and see if I'm talking to an NFC or a stranger.
Yeah, you've done a great job. I mean, I like to contribute to it. I think it's a great cause. You and Emily both are you're waving the flag hard, and you're not. What I like about it, Bob, is I think you might have found a good place for you because, as you've alluded to in our conversation today, you found yourself in some prickly spots, running a fly shop, dealing with biologists, going into legislative meetings. No one can argue about preserving native brook trout. And that's no one can argue that with you. And so for that reason, I think it's very disarming and actually in some ways it's very reflective because now when I look at the work you're doing, it says to me, well, let's look back at some of the other things that you've done. And I'm starting to pick up, some of your other books and read some of your writing and starting to realize that over the years that I think you've been largely misunderstood. And I think it's really great that you had the opportunity to join us today. And, you have a very strong speaking voice and your message has always resonates. Whether people like it or not, they hear it. And then there's an old saying Bob Dion used to say is, listen to me now, hear me later. So you would just wonder if they were listening or hearing. But and my point is today, I'm hearing you loud and clear, and I really like having you in my life, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Likewise, Mike. It's a small group that's going to have to drive a big truck and more people that are on board.
No, and for that reason, Bob, I have to say thank you because you and Emily and really the whole group of NFC are just really, really doing a great job for something that it can't advocate. The brook trout can't advocate for themselves, and not just brook trout, any native fish. I mean, that's the other thing that people need to understand about NFC is, red eye smallmouth bass in Alabama. Am I right? Is that
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, NFC is not just about trout. It's about any native fish and protecting where they are. I'm convinced, Bob, that we could talk all day because you have so much to add and share. And I just encourage anybody, I encourage our audience to buy Bob's books. I encourage the audience to do a little more research about who Bob is, because he's leaving a very large footprint in contemporary Maine fly fishing. And Bob, thank you. We really appreciate you joining the podcast, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to share some experiences with us.
Thanks for having me.
That brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for joining us for this intimate discussion, and thank you for listening to Flyline Podcast. A new Flyline Podcast episode will be released every 2 weeks on Tuesdays, so be sure to come back to meet our next famous guest. Until then, this is Michael Jones. Flyline Podcast is a product of Riverside FM.